Hello, folks. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us for our recap of Tuesday's budget vote. Thanks so much for joining us. We're really excited to recap what happened. Welcome, welcome. So, just to share with you all who we are a collective, a coalition of a bunch of people fighting for the people's budget. We're the People's Budget Coalition, and we are a coalition that has existed for a couple of years now, advocating for the people's budget. And it's composed of a number of different organizations who are advocating on different coalitions and organizations to make sure that our communities are represented when it comes to the budget, really coming from a place that our community should be engaged and represented by how the city allocates money towards our community. Before we get started, I would like to do an acknowledgement of land, acknowledging that we're on Tongva people land and that the Puunga community was established here, and it's a sacred site of the Gabrielino Tongva people, where Cal State Long Beach is now occupied. And we stand in solidarity with our brothers and sisters that continue to fight to keep that site sacred for the remains of their community and their families to be sharing that space. We would like to take the second to encourage people to share this event and contribute to the conversation on the chat on social media. Please drop your thoughts, your ideas, your encouragements, all the things that you would want to talk about. We really want to encourage you to drop those insights onto our social media and also to share it. Share it with your folks, share it with community. This is how, due to the COVID era, this is how we're communicating with each other. And we would love to have that conversation continue to go on your social media streams as well. So please share us and engage with us. And I would like to go ahead and get us introduced to our folks. So I will start with myself. My name is Marlene Montañez, and I am with Long Beach Forward. And I would love to introduce the amazing folks that I get to be part of, which is Audrina from Black Lives Matter, Gabi from Long Beach Immigrants' Rights Coalition, and Elsa from Long Beach Forward as well. So welcome, folks. How are y'all feeling? I see people pumped up. Thanks, Elsa, for the enthusiasm. I'm gonna get us started with the first question already. Y'all feeling ready for that? Right.
Let's do it.
So what are the highlights and key takeaways for you from the Long Beach budget adoption? Elsa, would you like to get us started?
Yes, absolutely. Hello. I was trying to shift my seating to my janky little sign could be read. So yes, actually, if we can get the slide up too, team, so we can talk about what we won in this year's People's Budget. This process actually started in March of this year. And in March of this year, the Long Beach City Council approved a spending plan for the approximately $250 million in federal and state economic recovery funds. This was a one-time federal infusion of money. So we had a mini campaign in March. You folks in social media world may remember we did a very similar discussion as we're doing right now. Back then, we called it the People's Recovery. That People's Recovery and the Long Beach Recovery Act was combined with the regular city budget in this process. So here we'll talk about our primary and tangible community wins, and we'll focus on the yellow portion of the slide. Yeah, and then I'll talk about the other half of the slide. But the yellow portion, we won $1 million for housing navigators to assist renters. This is for information, for resources, for renters to know their rights. We have so many folks during this pandemic and actually long before that are the majority of the city. 60% of Long Beach are renters, yet we don't have a place for them to go to understand their information, understand their rights, and understand all of these very complicated eviction moratoriums and protections that we've had during the pandemic. So $1 million for housing navigators. We also have won $1 million for a community land trust. What that is community owned, permanently affordable housing. This is an extremely important step to take back land and housing from the speculative real estate market into the community. The youth, the Invest in Youth campaign also won $1 million out of the Measure US or Measure Us pot of money. That was a voter approved ballot measure from November 2020, and that has generated an amount of revenue that's split into 3 pots, and the youth won $1 million out of that. Next slide. We also won $810,000 for a tenant right to counsel program. We established this program in Long Beach last year and last budget. That was a big budget win for last year. And we're continuing this funding for eviction defense for renters and tenants to have legal services for their eviction defense. We won $700,000 for the language access policy. This has been a long-standing policy in the city to translate and interpret documents and important city meetings for the purposes of limited English proficiency speakers, so that they can participate in our city's government, in our city's process, and have access to the city services that they need. And finally, we have won $600,000 for the Long Beach Justice Fund for deportation defense legal services for our immigrant families and neighbors. The second half of the slide, the right side of the slide, is just a breakdown on which pieces of our wins were from the one-time Long Beach Recovery Act and which pieces of our wins were from the actual city budget. And you'll see both in this slide and in the previous slide, most of our wins were from the Long Beach Recovery Act, which is just a one-time infusion. So this means that these wins need to be sustained in the regular city budget, which is, it's a bigger fight ahead of us because once these one-time funds go away, that's it. And we need to really rely on the regular city budget. So with that, I will turn it over to my colleagues.
Thank you, Elsa. Audrina or Gabby, do you want to pick up?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'll say that those are the highlights of this campaign, right? Like we won a lot of things, and I think we want to give props to all of the community members that showed up and made public comment, met with city council, right? Attended rallies, attended teach-ins, attended hearings, to make sure that we got all these wins, right? So I think for us as a People's Budget Coalition, we definitely had a lot of wins that we got to celebrate. But also we're disappointed, right, that the city continues to invest in policing and doesn't give the importance that it's needed for community programming or community services, right? Like we had countless folks show up at council during this budget cycle, and it seemed like the council members were not interested in hearing the lived experience from community members that were speaking and demanding that the city reimagine the city budget, right? Currently, we have a city budget that is allocating almost half of the general budget for policing, which, you probably heard us all say, but it's $782,000 a day on policing. So it's outrageous, right? When you think about it, it's almost $1 million that is being spent on policing ADA. We can't continue to think that that's okay. We can't continue to have a city council that doesn't see that there's anything wrong with that. So for us, a big takeaway was like, we're going to continue to build the power that we need in order to have the city council recognize that, decades of investing in policing has not worked, has failed, and it's evident, right? We have one of the worst police departments in the state, if not the country. Like, people don't like to think about that or talk about that, but it's the reality, right? Like, it's not okay to have a department that is mass surveilling people, right? And we hear them say that's not true, but we know for a fact that it is. So, I mean, anyone that can do an RFP, a request, a public records request, can find out about all of these things that we've been, talking about. So I think for us is we'll continue to fight to have the city council recognize that we can't continue to invest in policing, but we're also super grateful and thankful to the community members that showed up and made sure that we had these wins that Elsa just went through. And I'll pass it over to Adrina.
Okay. I'd like to add, it's hard to see some of the wins. And I'll say it's hard to see some of the wins because they received so little money and because they involve a lot of new programming development. So, for example, funding for the REACH program, which is an outreach program to the homeless community, which added some positions to our health department to deal with a public health nurse, for example, a mental health clinician, and then 2 outreach workers. So that's great. We need that REACH program to expand, and we actually need to add more mental health clinicians and community outreach workers for the community beyond just the homeless community. But I accept that we have to start somewhere. I would have liked to have seen the city council, the BOC really put some more money into this rather than buying lamps for Bluff Park, historic lamps for Bluff Park, rather than giving $200,000 to the Bixby Knolls business district. Would rather have seen them take those pots of money and really apply them to the notion of investing in community and helping our communities really to deal with some of the issues it's facing. On the other hand, on the other side, something that's also difficult for us to see is the continued support for the program set out in the racial reconciliation effort that the city engaged in last year. Much harder to see that because, again, these things are all being set up and trying to develop them. For example, there was money set aside to train city staff for mental health crises response. Very excited about that because, as you know, that's one of the things we were calling for in terms of alternative to policing. Very excited to see that the process has begun to transform our Citizens Police Complaint Commission into an oversight body. But again, these things take time. Also glad to see there's $1 million allocated, almost $1 million allocated to youth funding, which is very good. We need that. And happy to see that as part of the racial reconciliation, there's continued ongoing effort for reentry to provide resources and such for our siblings who are coming home after spending time incarcerated. So, some of the gains are harder to see, but they're there. And I think the fight going forward is to make sure that the dollars allocated to them grow, and 2, that the city's commitment to the funding continues to grow. We know they have no problem throwing pots of money here and there, and certainly disappointingly to increase the police budget by $16 million this year was just disappointing. Yeah, so I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Audrina. Thank you, Gabby, and Elsa for recapping all of that and sharing that insight. And I think you've already began to kind of lead into our next question, which is where were some lessons learned or insights gained through this process? I think Audrina kind of started getting us started on that, and I would love to hear from folks like what were some lessons learned or insights gained throughout this process. Gabby, would you like to get us started?
Yes. And I also just like to add, I think what Adrina has mentioned, and it's really disappointing that the city is continuing to increase the budget for police, but it's just also flat out wrong. Like it's just not okay that they're doing that, right? So it's disappointing to us, but it's wrong that they're continuing to invest in policing. I think some big lessons for us is that we need more of you. We need more of you watching, more community. We know that there's folks that have lived experience that also have a passion for justice, right? And envision a city where a budget is considering the priorities of the community. So I think for us is that we need a lot of you to show up, to join us in this journey, to come, to the teach-ins, to show up to city council, right? A lot of folks always ask, like, what can I do? What should I do? There's many ways of folks getting involved, right? And you can do it from your home too. There's many of you that are needed to show city council that there is tons of support for a new reimagined city budget where we're not throwing millions of dollars at the police. And so I think for us, that was one of the biggest takeaways and lessons learned. And I think also it tells a lot that the city definitely does not want to include us in this process, so much that in the middle of a pandemic, when the Delta variant was at its peak, they didn't allow for virtual public comments, right? Or virtual assistant, being able to show up to some of this. So I think that was also a huge lesson that the city is going to do whatever they can to diminish the participation of community in this process. So I think for us is also ensuring that we're there, if you're able to, that you can show up, right? We know that not everyone feels safe in being in public and being with other people, but your voice is important, and I think a lot of the public comments that we heard during the last two city council meetings were saying, like, those folks work for us, right? They're accountable to us. And we need to make sure that they know that and that they see the community power and that they feel that they're accountable to us. Otherwise, this will continue to happen. They will continue to make decisions that are leaving us out of the process. So I think just to wrap it up, I'll say that there's ways of people getting involved, and we need many of you to continue this process. And we also need a lot of education at the city council level. Like, people really don't understand the harms of policing. Like, when police is there presenting, they take their word for whatever they say, without digging into it, without maybe doing research on their own, without establishing a way of informing their decisions, right? I don't think they know. That's how disconnected they are from the communities that they're advocating for more investment in communities. They don't understand the impacts, and so they need more education around the harms of policing and what it does to Black and Brown communities and poor communities of color.
Thank you, Gabby. Elsa, would you like to answer the question as well?
Sure. Yeah, I'll just say, and I know Gabby can speak to this as well, but I was grateful and proud to be a part of the very first People's Budget campaign back in 2018. That's fiscal year 2019. And so seeing the evolution of this movement actually gives me a ton of hope. I agree that that actually in this year's budget, we not only did not, the city not only did not defund the police, but they actually refunded police. They added a couple of new positions in the police department. So I think that's a huge uphill battle, but seeing the evolution of the movement over 4 years and what is to come, I think is tremendously hopeful and powerful. Our movement has become bigger and bigger in scope, bigger in our demands, in our dollar amounts, in our clarity of centering Black lives, communities of color, and marginalized communities. So you know, I'm really hopeful, but I do see, yeah, I mean, I do see the structural challenges ahead. And having been through this now for 4 years, um, and it was really highlighted for me last year after the uprisings, that the city budget and the budgeting process is meant to preserve the status quo. The system is meant to preserve the system. I mean, I think we know that inherently, but the budgeting, the way the budgeting works, where they're just sort of looking at last year's, making a few adjustments, and making that to be this year's. It's just perpetuating year over year over year the same funding amounts, the same pie charts, the same proportions. You know, 42% this year, 44% last year is going to the police out of the general fund. It's the same thing over and over and over again. Structurally, the budget system is flawed and is meant to preserve the status quo, and the status quo is those who have power and money. So we, yeah, there's a lot to be done to change that, starting with the growth of our movement, and also moving into, you know, new strategies for change, including possibly, you know, multi-year, long-term campaigns, long-term strategies to really fundamentally shift the budgeting process, the budgeting system, the way that our city makes decisions about the allocation of our taxpayer dollars. So I think there's some deeper stuff to come, and actually I'm really, really excited for that. This year's process was just an example of not only a flawed public process, but a deeply abridged and short public process that's clearly not meant for public engagement or any amount of public influence or decision making. It was cut short. There was, very little language access, and as Gabby alluded to, in the middle of the pandemic, there was still no virtual access. So yeah, a lot to be said and a lot to be done, but very excited for what's to come.
Thank you, Elsa. That actually leads us to the next question, which is what are next steps for accountability and getting people involved and organized, right? Like our conversations can't be insular. We can't just be talking with each other. So what do we see as our next steps for accountability, not only for ourselves, but also for other community members in order for them to get involved or organized? Audrina, would you like to kick this off?
Yeah, I mean, I'm just thinking about my mother. You know, my mother used to say, and my mother still says, that things you do in the dark will come to light, right? And as I said in answering the first question, so much of some of the victories that were important to Black Lives Matter Long Beach are long-term, they're long haul, they're developmental, they're in processes. And so I want to be involved in doing a lot of public education so that these things are in the light, because in the light is where the accountability is. And making sure that they don't get forgotten because they needed to be developed. For example, you know, all the mental health programs, I mean, as much as we'd like to say, just hire people, but, you know, it's a municipality, they have to think more carefully about how these things get spent. But if we're not present, if we're not pushing the envelope, if we're not asking and demanding, always demanding. If we're not demanding what we need and then alerting the public, informing the public, then these things will get forgotten, and we'll end up with more funding for things like the Office of Constitutional Policing, or teaching active bystander lessons to fellow police officers, or $20.8 million for the infrastructure improvements to police and fire academies. All those are the kinds of monies that could be moved over to the kinds of programs we mean when we say invest in community and divest from policing. But again, these things were not part of the city structure before, so they have to get up. So that's our job, is to make sure that the city keeps moving in that direction, specifically the Office of Equity, and that the city is holding to what it said with regard to the racial reconciliation process it developed last year. And then I want to push the city to go back to zero-based budgeting. I don't know if you all remember last year, it was all this talk about, oh yeah, we're really going to move towards zero-based budgeting. And it's like, okay, we didn't do that this year. We started from the same template, and and on some things they doubled down, which is exact opposite of what was promised to us as a community last year. So I think in public education, holding our elected leaders accountable for the things they say and the things we need. And then, quite frankly, some civic engagement in some other ways. Some door knocking, some phone calling, some really targeting some folks who don't seem to comprehend, or they do understand. Dismiss what community needs, and it's not historic lamps in Bixby.
Thank you, Audrina. Gabby?
Yes. So I think I can build up from that. I really heard a lot of people tell us that they didn't even know who their council member was or who the city manager is. And, if you don't know, the city manager has a lot of power in the city. So you should know who he is. And you should know who your council member is. So as part of that education is getting folks involved and for them to get to know who represents them and who they should be calling and keeping accountable for this. Because every single, council member voted in this budget. And a lot of them stayed silent when it came to the funding the police piece and reimagining the budget. And it's because, I don't think they're not educated enough, but also they need all of our folks to contact them. But to begin that, we need to know who they are first, right? So I think for us, part of that education is going to be ensuring that folks know who that council member is and who the city manager is and who the mayor is, so that they can hold them accountable, because it's key, right? And the number one thing that you need first is like their phone number. And actually for people to know that you can call that council member for whatever you need. Folks with resources already do that. So now it's turn for our folks to do that also. I think the other big piece is implementation for all of this, wins that we had. I think now it's like we had the budget. Now, how do we ensure that the implementation of that money happens? We know, working with the city, that we need to be on top of this in order for us to see the potential successes that can come from this investments. And they're not going to happen unless we are holding them accountable, right? Communities holding them accountable and ensuring that this implementation happens. And that's going to require involvement from community. I think another big thing is also demanding respect from council members. I think I said this during the first question, but a lot of times when community members were doing public comment in this budget cycle, they were looking at their phones. They simply stepped out. They were looking down. These are like, the fact that they're doing that, they think that no one's watching, right? So I think they need to know that all of you are watching them, that all of you will hold them accountable. It's unacceptable for them to be talking to each other, looking down their phone, leaving when community it's given their testimonies and saying why they need to be reimagining the budget. So I think that's going to be something that we're going to continue to work on. And if council members are watching this, you all need to reflect on that. It's unacceptable that you do that and that you don't think as human beings that you need to respect us. Again, I think many folks during public comment said, you all work for us, which is another big thing. And I think what Audrina was alluding to, right? There's other ways of getting engaged. Some of these folks are up for re-election next year. I think it's important for folks to know who are those seats that are up for re-election. and it's a way of holding them accountable, right? If they're not pushing your priorities as community forward, you need to hold them accountable. And one way of doing that is during this election season that will happen next year in June. So I know that the districts that are up for re-election are 1, 3, 5, 7, and 9. So a lot of them. Keep an eye out for that and ensure that you're holding folks accountable on that end as well.
Thank you, Gabby and Audrina, for answering that in such a holistic way. There's a number of ways for our communities to get engaged, get involved, and be part of the conversation, and also things that don't involve even showing up to council, but knowing how council can be held accountable. So thank you for all of that insight. And also the next steps. We have a lot of ambitions that go beyond just this vote, and that we know this is work that's going to go on for years, maybe something that we might not even see the product of, which I hope is not true, and that we actually get to see that product of it. So thank you so much for your time. I would like to invite those that are tuning in to actually join our text messaging list. If you want to stay in contact and know what's going on and be part of our action list, I invite you to text POWER, POWER, to 56525. So POWER to 56525. I know that was a lot of fives. So text POWER to 56525 and you'll receive future related people's budget action alerts. And also we invite you to learn more about all of our partners. It's not just our organizations who made this possible or fight for this. It's an array. It's all of the organizations listed at the bottom. It takes a whole lot of community effort and a lot of community love to get together, have these really hard conversations, and fight alongside each other. So we invite you to visit our website at longbeachforward.org, People's Budget, to find links to other organizations. And we invite you to join these organizations and the amazing work that they're doing with their community and building power. So with that said, thank you. Thank you for your time, panelists. We really appreciate you all making the time to make this happen. And thanks for whoever's tuning in. We look forward to seeing you on the streets, in the polls, and wherever else we gather to create community. Have a great day. Goodbye, folks.